Thank you so much for joining us at this event today, Understanding the Minds of Others in Fiction, Play, and Reality. It's really wonderful to see so many people interested in this topic. My name is Pamela Smith. I'm the director of the Center for Science and Society. And this speaker series, organized by the Presidential Scholars in Society and Neuroscience, brings together interdisciplinary perspectives in mind, brain, and behavior research. For today's event, we have a really fantastic, stellar group of speakers who will discuss how our social interactions and experiences in play and fictional worlds affect our ability to understand the minds of others. If this is your first seminar in Society and Neuroscience, I want to tell you a little bit about the program and the Center for Science and Society. The Presidential Scholars in Society and Neuroscience program facilitates cross-disciplinary collaborative research to advance our understanding of mind, brain, and behavior. It brings together talented early career scholars from various fields with faculty experts in neuroscience, in the humanities, the arts, and the social sciences. The core of the program is our early career postdoctoral scholars who pursue independent research at the intersection of neuroscience and the arts, humanities, and social sciences. Each scholar receives tailored support for their project from at least 2 faculty mentors who are from different departments who have relevant knowledge and expertise to guide their research. Current mentors come from neuroscience, sociology, psychology, psychiatry, medical humanities and ethics, music, philosophy, English, and comp lit, as well as many other disciplines. The scholars and the PSSN faculty are central in organizing these interdisciplinary events. You can see that our host today, Valerio Amoretti, has 4 mentors from different fields. So Valerio has helped to organize this event, as do all the scholars. And I want to just say that we have another event coming up soon, May 11th, with presentations from 2 presidential scholars, Julia Highland-Bruno and Matthew Sachs, who are both leaving the PSSN program this summer. They've come to the end of their 3 years. So please join us in person or online to learn about the speakers' cross-disciplinary journeys at Columbia, their research findings and conclusions, and the next steps in their careers. Their faculty mentors at this event in May will offer brief responses after each talk, and we'll provide links to this event, to register for this event in the chat today. Speaking of the chat, you can sign up for our newsletter at our website. You can register for upcoming events and also find us on social media and online. For today's event, you can participate in the discussion at any time using the Q&A button located at the bottom of your screen, as you all probably know by now. You can also upvote questions that you see in the Q&A submitted by others, when we'll answer as many of your questions as we possibly can at the end of the event. The PSSN program would not be possible without the support of leadership at Columbia, our valued steering committee members, and faculty from across the university who participate on the advisory committee, mentor our scholars, and volunteer to review and interview applicants. Thanks to all of you who have helped make this program an example of interdisciplinary achievement. We will be providing ways to keep in touch in the chat throughout the event. Now, I'd like to introduce our moderator and organizer, Presidential Scholars, Valerio Amoretti. Dr. Amoretti is a literary scholar who studies how reading and writing affect our mind and brain. In particular, Dr. Amoretti draws from contemporary object relations psychoanalysis to understand the role that literature and narrative play in enabling long-term psychic change and creativity. As a presidential scholar, he is exploring the neural basis for these processes. Dr. Amoretti received his PhD from Columbia in 2019 from the Department of English and Comparative Literature, with a dissertation focusing on the psychic work involved in reading modernist fiction. I'm going to hand it over now to Dr. Amoretti.
Thank you, Pamela. I hope you can hear me okay. So thank you to all of you joining us. I wanted to acknowledge right at the start The work done by Dr. Melinda Miller and by Joseph Sulik and others at the Center for Sense and Society, and helping us creating and organizing and promoting this event. But more importantly, I wanted to mention that this event is actually the idea of Dr. Claire McCormack, whom you've seen in the slides that Pamela showed. Claire was a PSSN scholar like me until very recently, and she's now a research scientist at NYU's Langone Department of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, and we owe her for the original idea for this event. So the question we'll look at today, which is how do we understand the minds of others, is exceptionally vast and has a long and complicated history that crosses many disciplines. So one can start almost anywhere, but I'm going to spend a few minutes just with a short detour on the history of empathy. Empathy is a relatively new word in English. It has been used for just over 100 years. And prior to that, much of the same conceptual space was actually covered by the word sympathy, which had a very rich history from the 17th to the 19th century. David Hume and Adam Smith were among those writing about sympathy, and the latter even suggested that it was the bond that holds society together. And Darwin also used the concept. Meanwhile, in Germany, a new word, which I'm going to mispronounce as Einfühlung, which literally translates as feeling into, was being born in the context of philosophy, of aesthetics. Now, most people credit one young Robert Fisher for inventing the word in his dissertation in 1873, but actually the popularizer of Einfühlung was a philosopher called Theodor Lipps. Lipps was responsible for the migration of the term from aesthetic philosophy into the then emergent discipline of psychology. And one big fan of Lipps's work was Sigmund Freud. Freud saw that empathy was a vital avenue in the patient and analyst relationship. But in a case of missed connections, when Freud's English translators encountered the word Einfühlung in German, the word empathy hadn't fully established itself in English. So the translators were caught off guard by the words double life in aesthetics and psychology, and unsure what to do. They ended up leaving empathy out of most of the English standard edition of Freud's work, specifically out of all the clinical material. And there's also another interesting twist to the tale. The British-American psychologist who came up with the word empathy to translate Einfühlung thought that he was following Theodor Lipps's idea in using Einfühlung to distinguish between sympathy and empathy. However, scholars today believe that this was a complete misunderstanding and that for Lipps, sympathy and empathy were actually simply synonymous. But by that time, of course, empathy had been widely adopted in English, and the original meaning of sympathy had been displaced. So the reason for this detour, the reason I wanted to start with this detour is twofold. On the one hand, I wanted to suggest that today's topic has always been a difficult one to define precisely, and that overlapping terms have been used for a long time. And on the other hand, I wanted to point out that it has a really long history of hopping disciplinary boundaries. In other words, it's a topic of inherent interdisciplinary interest. Now, today, many scholars, including research psychologists, continue to use the term empathy alongside more specific terminology such as theory of mind, mind reading, mentalization, and so on. And there are fine differences between all of these terms, and perhaps our speakers today will help us define some of them more clearly. One could point out that the older terms invoking pathos seem to suggest an effective and perhaps unconscious grasp of the minds of others, whereas newer terms that invoke reading and theory appear to lean more towards a deliberate cognitive operation. And one may also want to ask whether the ability to infer another's feelings is the same as the ability to infer another's thoughts and intentions. So are the more cognitive ends of empathy on a continuum with the more effective ends, or do these lean into different and discrete mechanisms? And what are the advantages of thinking, or indeed the disadvantages of thinking of those as a single faculty versus thinking of them as separate faculties? Further, one could ask what causes our ability to understand the minds of others, which is so elegantly fine-tuned in some cases to fail so spectacularly in other cases. And I'm not referring here necessarily to people whose mind reading faculties may be impaired, perhaps from birth, but also to the variability in the degree to which any given one of us is capable of empathy in one situation and then utterly incapable of it in the next. And finally, what can the study of empathy in children's play do to advance the discussion of empathy and theory of mind in the context of art and literature? In a 1967 paper called The Location of Cultural Experience, Donald Winnicott pointed out that children's play and adults' engagement with art and culture share the same location, in the sense that they are both activities that take place in what he called the potential space between the self and the environment. They're both creative activities, in other words, but they're also activities that rely on our understanding of the minds of others. So what is the connection between play, empathy, and creativity? So with these first few questions in mind, I'm going to turn to our three speakers. I'm going to introduce them just as they come on the stage, on the virtual stage. So the first speaker today is Dr. Meghan Meyer. Dr. Meyer is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences at Dartmouth College and the director of the Dartmouth Social Neuroscience Lab. Her research in social and cognitive neuroscience asks a broad range of questions related to how we navigate our complex social worlds. And she's authored dozens of scientific articles on a range of topics related to social cognition, including theory of mind, self-other representation, and the role of resting state or default mode brain activity in processing social information. So Dr. Meyer, over to you.
Thank you all for being here today. I'm really excited to be at this really interesting and interdisciplinary forum, and I'm looking forward to hearing your different thoughts and questions about the work I'll show you today. And to get us started, I just thought it'd be nice to consider the question of, what does it really mean to excel at creating fiction? Some individuals, like the ones shown here, seem to invent entirely new worlds, new stories, and new characters, and really bring them to life. So clearly, I think we would all agree that they excel at imagination based simply on the quality of their creative output. And yet, at the same time, it's not like they're the only people in the world who can imagine things, right? Everyone falls somewhere on the imagination bell curve, and most of us can imagine all kinds of things. The people I just showed you happen to fall on the upper end of the distribution. And so what my team and I recently wanted to figure out was what mental skill set gets them to this higher end of the distribution. And while we don't know a ton in terms of a scientific understanding about the sort of key ingredients to getting to this top end of the distribution, there is a lot of research on the typical person's imagination. And a lot of what we know comes from research on what psychologists refer to as simulation, which simply refers to our ability to imagine experiences outside of our here and now. And we can all simulate in multiple domains. So in the temporal domain, we can imagine what our day may be like tomorrow. In the spatial domain, we might imagine, walking down the street and getting a coffee a few blocks down the road. In the social domain, we might imagine or simulate what our friend is thinking or feeling, perhaps during a conversation. And hypothetical simulations refer to imagining something that would just contradict your present reality, right? Imagining you were, for example, a lawyer instead of a researcher. And so although each of these types of simulation differ in their content, they're known to commonly recruit the brain's default network, shown here, suggesting that this network in the brain may at least partially underpin human imagination. Now, each of the simulation examples I just walked us through, they all fall in the category of what researchers call proximal simulations. And the average imaginer is really quite proficient in vividly imagining proximal experiences. They're proximal in that they're not that far from our everyday experience. But what the average imaginer finds really challenging are more distal simulations. So for example, people can obviously try to imagine their life in 10 years from now, or waking up one day a new person entirely. But research shows that the quality of their simulations drops off dramatically when trying to do so. So their distal simulations are far less vivid and concrete and much more abstract and fuzzy. And so one possibility is that while the average imaginer can only go so far in terms of distal simulation ability, expertise in fiction and storytelling may be associated with the ability to really extend our vivid and rich simulations more distally. And so that was the hypothesis that my group and I walked into this set of studies with. We hypothesized that the ability to really vividly imagine distal events specifically, which should be underpinned by the brain's default network, would be associated with expertise in fiction. And so here's how we sought to test this hypothesis. So we ran 2 different studies. I'm going to walk you through the first one now. We recruited creative experts from the arts and entertainments. And here we defined creative expert as any individual who either had been recognized by a prestigious award for their creative work. So for example, a Sundance Screenwriting Award, or if they held a position at a prestigious institution known for excellence in their domain, or if they attained commercial success in their domain. So for example, if they wrote a best-selling novel or a hit TV show. And so I just wanted to give you a flavor for the kinds of people we recruited. These are the same people I showed you in the beginning of the talk. Each of these participants individuals participated in this study. Now, in addition to recruiting writers, directors, and actors who all have expertise in fiction, we also recruited individuals who were highly successful visual artists, like this woman shown here, Helen O'Leary. And this allowed us to examine whether our results were preferential to creative expertise in narrative and fiction versus creative pursuits more broadly. Now, in addition to our creative experts, we also recruited a control group targeting professionals working in the legal, medical, and financial industries. We picked these particular industries simply because past research has identified individuals in these professions as, on average, scoring in the mid to low range on standardized tests of creativity. And it's worth pointing out that these 2 groups of participants were matched on gender, education level, and overall income. And all of our participants completed an online distal simulation task. So they were shown simulation prompts like these in the temporal, spatial, social, and hypothetical domains. There was also this control condition prompt, what I'm calling the visual control. The purpose of this prompt was to see if any differences between the groups, again, were preferential to distal simulations above and beyond completing this kind of task, where here in the visual control task, you don't have to imagine anything. Instead, you're asked to literally describe what you see right in front of you. So for the simulation prompts, participants were instructed to imagine the experience and write a description of at least about 2 paragraphs describing their simulation. And next, they rated the quality of their overall simulation on a 0 to 100 scale to these different items. For the visual control prompt, participants were instructed to attend to the image and describe what they saw. And then subsequently, they also made ratings, but they rated the extent to which they were immersed in and focused on the task. Now, in addition to analyzing the data from these subjective ratings, we were also able to get a more objective measure of the simulation quality. So we subjected the participants' written responses, those paragraphs, to a lexical analysis that was developed specifically to assess text vividness, to again give us a more objective measure to complement the subjective ratings. Now, the first thing I wanted to show you is that these 2 groups appear to be matched on at least their perceived or overall self-reported career success. We had them all rate on a 0 to 100 scale. How successful have you been in your career? And the 2 groups did not significantly vary in terms of how successful they think they've been in their career. But in terms of their distal simulation success, so to speak, we do see that our creative experts are outperforming the control group. This is their subjective ratings on a 0 to 100 scale of how sort of vividly they were able to imagine the prompts, for example. And these are the results from the text analysis, which was our more objective measure of simulation quality. And again, we're seeing that the creative experts were outperforming the controls. Now, this is lumping all of our creative experts together. But remember, one of the things we wanted to know is whether, it's really about expertise in fiction that would facilitate this kind of distal simulation quality. And so when we break down our participants based on their profession, you can see that indeed we are seeing that the people who are driving those results I just showed you are the folks who have expertise in fiction. So actors and directors are actually lumped in one category in this study because it turns out when we were recruiting these really successful actors and directors, pretty much all of them had expertise or experience in both acting and directing. So if they were a known actor, they actually had a lot of experience directing. And if they were a known director, they had also had a lot of training in acting. So we put them together for that reason. And really the point of this overall slide is to show that the visual artists, while obviously very successful and talented in their field, were not the ones that were producing particularly good distal simulations in this paradigm. Now, so far, our results suggest that expertise in fiction, right, corresponds with producing these more vivid distal simulations, both in terms of subjective and objective qualities. But it's not clear yet how fiction experts are able to generate these superior distal simulations. And my team and I, when we put our heads together, we figured there's sort of at least two different possibilities that could explain what's going on here. So one possibility is that creative experts in fiction may be able to use their sort of proximal simulation muscle to better imagine distal events, right? So in other words, the same mechanism that most of us use to just imagine proximal events, for whatever reason, fiction experts might be able to use that same mechanism to better simulate distal events as well. Now, the second possibility, though, is that they switch to a different muscle to imagine distal events. In other words, while all of us, both fiction and nonfiction experts, use a certain mechanism for our proximal simulations, fiction experts might be able to switch or turn on a different muscle to imagine distal simulations well, a muscle that the rest of us aren't as able or agile to engage during distal simulation. And so to sort of test which of these two possibilities best explain what's going on in our data, we next ran another study where, again, we recruited creative experts, though here we actually specifically only recruited experts in fiction since we knew that we weren't going to get a lot of action in what we were interested in with visual artists. So we have our fiction experts and our controls. You'll notice that the sample size, the N, is smaller in this particular study than in our online study. That's because rather than being an online experiment that you can blast all over the world, we recruited these participants to complete a brain imaging study. So here we had them complete simulation tasks while we tracked which regions of the brain they used to simulate the different scenarios. So now I'm just going to show you what our different trial types look like from the point of view of a participant. So here's an example of a simulation trial that's proximal in the temporal domain. They're asked to imagine browsing a bookstore, the next day in 24 hours. Next, they rate how vivid their simulation was. Again, this is a totally subjective assessment that the participant completes in the scanner. Now, here's an example of another temporal trial, but that's much more distal, right? 100 years from now, imagine sitting on a plane and waiting for takeoff. Participants have 14 seconds to engage their simulations, and then they make their ratings about the vividness. So now I want to show you the same paradigm, but just from more of a bird's eye view, so that you can see that we have participants engaging proximal and distal simulation in each of these different domains. We ran this particular study in Princeton, New Jersey. So New York City was the relatively proximal location, whereas Tokyo, for example, was the distal location. And it's worth pointing out that these individual trial events, things like going to a party where you don't know anyone, for example, they weren't random events. They were all normed in advance on a number of dimensions, so that all we were really doing here was manipulating the proximal versus distal simulation. And so the first thing I want to show you was participants' self-reported vividness scores to the different trial types, plotted separately for the fiction experts and the controls. And so first off, what you can see is that for the proximal trial types, there's no significant difference between our groups in terms of how vivid they report being able to simulate those different trial types in the scanner. None of those bars are significantly different from one another. But here's what happens for the distal simulations. So it looks like for the fiction experts, they're still rating around a 3.2, 3.5 on a 1 to 4 scale for the quality of their the vividness of their distal simulations. And yet there's this tapering off for the control groups where they're not as able to at least report experiencing those simulations as vividly, which is consistent with prior work suggesting similar things in control group samples. Now, what's going on in the brain? Well, the first thing I wanted to point out is that when we look to see what brain regions are more associated with the proximal relative to distal simulation, so the easy simulation trial types, the results look really similar for both the creative experts or the fiction experts and the control group. So both groups show robust activity in this brain region shown here called the medial prefrontal cortex. It is a really key brain region in the brain's default network. And a number of researchers have tried to break down the default network into subsystems because it turns out the default network takes up a lot of real estate in the brain. And there's different subnetworks that sort of collectively comprise this broader default network. And this medial prefrontal cortex cluster falls in what is often referred to as the core subsystem of the default network. Now, what's going on for the distal relative to the proximal simulations? Well, here's what we see. The fiction experts engage a number of regions that interestingly are also in the default network, though are not in the core subsystem. Instead, these brain regions are in the dorsal medial subsystem of the default network. When you run the same comparison in controls, you don't actually see any significant clusters of brain activity that pop out for the distal relative to proximal simulations. And something that's important to point out is that the dorsal medial subsystem of the default network is actually the subsystem that's most consistently associated with social cognition, specifically imagining what other people are thinking and feeling, particularly people that are dissimilar from ourselves. And another thing that's really important to point out was that these results were not just specific to the social simulation prompts. In fact, all of the prompts like the temporal, spatial, hypothetical, in addition to the social prompts, showed this profile of results, even though the prompts themselves weren't particularly social. In fact, our participants also completed a resting state scan. So at the very beginning of the study, before doing any simulations for the task, they simply rest in the scanner for 6 minutes and we measured their brain function, their functional connectivity. And we again see that even simply at rest by default, the creative fiction experts are showing greater connectivity in that dorsal medial subsystem at rest, but no difference in the other key subsystems of the default network. And so to return to our different hypotheses, we do see evidence consistent with that second possibility, right? Fiction experts seem to switch to the dorsal medial subsystem to imagine distal events. In fact, they even have this network sort of more strongly engaged simply by default during rest. And this is really interesting because despite the fact that fiction involves various types of simulation content, when we're creating fiction, are imagining different times and places, hypotheticals and characters, and even in our tasks, we have people simulate in all these different domains. Nonetheless, it appears that it's the default network subsystem that's really key to social cognition, imagining other people's perspectives and understanding how they think and feel, that seems to be what's differentiating our fiction experts from the controls. And so these results sort of collectively suggest that perhaps training people in fiction might not only make them better at sort of creating fictional worlds that don't exist, but also perhaps better connect with the actual people in their everyday lives in the real world. And so with that, I just want to thank my team and wrap up here. And of course, I'm excited to hear what the other panelists share with you all today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's fascinating study. So our second speaker is Dr. Thalia Goldstein. Dr. Goldstein is Associate Professor of Applied Developmental Psychology at George Mason University. She directs the Social Skills and Imagination and Theater Lab, which conducts research looking both at the effects of engaging in pretend play and theater on children's social emotional skills, and how children understand and learn social information in fictional worlds. She's also the co-director of the Mason Arts Research Center, which is a multidisciplinary research center with a focus on arts engagement, child development, and education. She's also published widely on the topics of play, theater, and empathy in the context of development. So, Dr. Goldstein, over to you.
Great, thank you so much. And I'm absolutely thrilled actually to follow Dr. Meyer, because the last slide of her talk is all about how training in fiction may help develop the understanding of others' minds. And I'm about to give my talk on how training in fiction for children is associated with the understanding of others' minds and how that happens. So kudos to the organizers for putting us right next to each other in that way. So yes, I'm very excited to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. And today I'm going to be talking about my lab's work on role play and acting as embodied practice of others' minds. So my work and my lab's work takes on the question of when an actor is acting or when a child is engaging in pretend play and role play, how are they doing what they're doing? So what cognitive, social, and emotional skills are they recruiting in order to perform, either when they're pretending to be an explorer going through the jungle, or when a professional actor is putting on a costume and performing in a film or on stage? And then what may be the outcomes as a result of the act of performance and the act of learning how to be a character? And importantly for me comes from this phrase, learning to walk a mile in someone else's shoes, or see yourself in someone else's shoes, as a way of thinking about the actual embodied practice of fiction and imagination. So acting and role play and pretend play are different from just reading about somebody else's experiences through reading fictional books, although that's really great experience as well. And it's different from passive sitting and imagining fictional stories. And it's different from sitting and watching television or watching film, although all of those experiences involve a form of practice, involve a form of thinking about other people's perspectives. What my lab and what I'm particularly interested in is the active, physicalized, embodied practice of somebody else when you're pretending to be another. Now, of course, I am by far not the first person to think about this. Theories have long abounded about how audiences take on the perspectives of characters in order to achieve catharsis or emotional understanding in themselves. But there's actually not a lot of empirical research on how performing a character, actually embodying a fiction, may be affecting children. So what I'm going to present to you on the next slide is a bit of a summary of the work that my lab has done to this point from a quantitative empirical perspective. Over the last 15 years or so, we've been investigating from preschool all the way up to professionals engaged in role play and acting experiences. We've looked across a wide variety of theatrical activities, including dramatic pretend play interventions, acting classes, improvisational theater classes, drama-based pedagogies and integrated theater activities, and general surveys of arts engagement as both performers and audiences. And these studies have taken the form of everything from correlational studies to randomized control trials in the field. But what you can see from this slide, from these outcomes here, is that depending on the age group and what we're actually measuring, the findings are not perfectly consistent up to this point. Sometimes we find positive outcomes in theory of mind, which is this test of how do you think about other people's beliefs, desires, intentions, and emotions. But sometimes we don't find positive findings there. Sometimes we find positive findings in what we call empathy, which is the actual feeling of somebody else's emotions and the experience in oneself of what somebody else is going through. But other times we don't find differences in empathy. And important for my work as well is this construct of emotion regulation, which is the ability to alter and change your current emotional state in order to be more appropriate to the situation that you're in. And we think that in addition to understanding other people's mental states and feeling emotions in oneself, the ability to regulate those emotions that you're feeling in order to perform them for an audience is one of the key skills that an actor has to learn and is going to be associated with their empathic responses, because the more you can control your emotions, the more you can purposefully connect with others around those emotions. So after gathering these data over many years, in my lab, we started to ask the question of how. If there are associations, as we've found, between engaging in fiction and role play and acting, and these outcomes of social skills and social cognitive abilities, such as theory of mind and empathy, how might that be occurring? What kind of training, what kind of experiences, and what kind of classes, and particularly activities within classes, might children be going through in these kinds of acting activities that are being that are mechanistically or causally related to the outcomes that we've been finding so far? Is it a general process? Are teachers specifically teaching for it? And where and when might it happen? Also importantly, because the findings up to this point on our behavioral work have been pretty mixed as far as age group and type of study, we wanted to look at what might we be missing from the ground up. So the work that my lab has been engaging in for the last couple of years is a study on what we're calling theatrical thinking, the habits of mind taught through acting classes. And what we've been doing here is going into acting classes across the United States, particularly for high schoolers, and asking two main questions. The first question is, what are the actual activities that happen in acting classes? Not just acting theory, not just proposals from researchers, but what are teachers on the ground actually doing with their students? And then the second question that we're asking is, what kinds of habits of mind might be taught or fostered or recruited through these different activities? This is building off of work that Harvard Project Zero and its researchers have done in the visual arts and their book Studio Thinking, the Habits of Mind Taught in Visual Arts Classes. But we're focusing here on acting classes and looking at what the teachers are teaching and how implicitly and explicitly they may be teaching it. And the hope is to be able to then develop theory about how these kinds of activities are linked to outcomes in empathy and theory of mind. So what we did is we went to 5 different school districts. You'll note that our last 2 data recruitment days were in March of 2020. We finished, well, our data were sort of completed as of March 13th of 2020. That's the last day of data collection we had for this study. And we worked across 5 different districts that had very different goals in why they were teaching their students acting. So we were in a private stage in the suburbs on the East Coast, which is a conservatory program. We were in both urban and suburban and rural districts for schools. We were in both public arts conservatory high schools, private high schools, and public non-specialist high schools. So altogether, we worked in 3 suburban, 1 urban, and 1 rural district, 2 public, 2 private, and 1 magnet school, for a grand total of about 56.5 hours of classroom time across 40 different classes and 14 groups of students. So our hope here, through grounded theory qualitative analysis, was to investigate what was happening across all of these different districts. What types of activities did we see over and over again? And what kinds of skills were the teachers asking the students to practice? We found that every single acting class we filmed involved 4 different kinds of activities. The first kind of activity is preparation. So this involves vocal warm-ups, physical warm-ups, and explanations of what the teacher would like the student to do. The second kind of activity were generative activities. You can think of these as creative improvisations. So these were group and individual improvisational exercises that could involve the body, the mind, group interactions, or any combination of those 3. Importantly, regardless of the level of class or where we were filming, these 2 types of activities were about half of class time, whether the class was 45 minutes long or 2.5 hours long. The second 2 kinds of activities were reflection activities, in which teachers were constantly asking students to think about what they themselves did and whether or not it worked and how they might change it in the future, and then also reflect on their colleagues, their peers' activities and performances, whether or not it worked and how they might change it in the future. And they were asked to reflect across the preparation activities, the generation activities, And then our last set of activities, the interpretation activities. And these are the activities that you might actually think of when you think of an acting rehearsal or an acting class. These were things like scene study and character preparation, as well as discussions of characters. And when we looked, when we looked across the different kinds of class and the different lengths of class, you can see that these 4 kinds of activities were iterative, as well as jumping back and forth among the class time. So you can see across these 3 different examples that I'm giving you here. So the suburban public school, the magnet arts school, and in the private stage class, you can see from 60 minutes to 2 hours, they're using these kinds of activities across the different time spans, one on top of another. They're spending some blocks of time in one kind of activity, but then bouncing back and forth. And then importantly, when we did an analysis of what the teachers were actually teaching the students, we came up with 8 habits of mind. So habits of mind are considered mindsets or dispositional thinking strategies that students and adults bring to bear on the kinds of problems or activities that they are trying to engage in over the course of a class period. So you can think of these as the way in which the students are approaching activities and being asked to approach activities rather than individual psychological, cognitive, social, or emotional skills per se, but rather a perspective on what it is that the students are being asked to do. So the first one of these is body awareness and control. Students were constantly being reminded to think about their body, to work on where their body was in space and time. How do you express an emotion through your body? How does your control of your body show the audience what it is that you're trying to portray? This also involved a lot of discussion during the warm-up, which were jumping jacks and sit-ups and meditation, particularly embodied mindfulness. Our second habit of mind was all about imagining and envisioning, which connects directly back to Dr. Meyer's talk. This was students being asked to think about how would your character react in this time and space, but also things like what would the room feel like right now, and how would you move around the room if it started filling up with molasses, or if it was very, very hot or very, very cold. Theater, of course, is not purely representational. Even when you're on a fairly realistic set, you still have to imagine and envision what it might be like if it was fully filled in with all 4 walls and a ceiling. Students were constantly being asked to reflect and think metacognitively about the choices they were making and why they were making these choices. In addition to formal periods in which this reflection was happening, it was part of every single activity we saw the students engaging in. Students were constantly being told they needed to release their inhibitions and be playful. Try lots of different things, lose your self-judgment, even if it means looking silly in front of your friends, which for a group of 14 to 18-year-olds is a really important part of the training and not something they get anywhere else in their school day. Students were always being asked to consider others explicitly as well as implicitly, and you can see direct teaching here to constructs such as theory of mind and empathy. Why does this character do what they do? What are they thinking in this moment? How is this character feeling towards these other characters? Students had to collaborate. Theater is a collaborative art. You have to, at the very least, understand what your director and your choreographer want, but also the actors had to be particularly in improvisational group exercises, collaborating with their peers in the classroom in order to think about how to best achieve the goals of any particular exercise. So again, practice for theory of mind and empathy. Students were being asked to commit to choices. So an actor who's trying to play 2 or 3 different objectives simultaneously is quite difficult to watch because the audience can't quite read or understand what they're performing. And so students were told to pick one choice, even if it was wrong, and really go for it. And then finally, sort of in congruence with committing to choices, students were asked to be flexible. So if one thing wasn't working, be flexible and try something else. So these were the habits of mind that we really discovered across all of these different acting classes, and all of them occurred across all of the different kinds of activities in the classes. But I want to point out these main 3: imagine and envision, considering other people, and collaborating as both implicit and explicit ways in which students are being taught through acting classes, through role play, through imaginative activities to gain in theory of mind and empathy. I know I'm close to the end of my presentation time, but I just wanted to point out that these different habits of mind circled upon themselves and were iterative in nature, just like the different sections of class. A student involved in scene study in which they had to perform a particular scene for critique from the director, the teacher, and their peers might start with body awareness as they perform, and then might be asked to reflect on what they just did, think flexibly about some other choices they could have made, consider how those choices might be read by an audience, imagine and envision how they might perform those choices with their bodies, then commit to one choice, release any inhibitions they might have about performing that choice, talk to the other people on stage about what they were about to do, and then perform again with body awareness about whether or not it was successful. And so this circle of the different habits of mind being used across the activities in these classrooms is where I think we're finding these connections between acting classes and the outcomes that we've seen so far in social skills such as empathy and theory of mind. So in the future, we're hoping to use these activities to start to develop some short-term interventions, looking at different kinds of acting activities, as well as expanding out to both younger and older age groups. So I think when it comes to understanding emotions and performing emotions, acting class is a really great way that we can start to think about training through fiction to these outcomes because of this separation that you get between the acting classroom where everything's supposed to be fun and fictional and safe and separated out from the rest of your world, and then going out into the real world to use those skills you've gained in your classes. So I want to say a quick thank you to all the parents, children, and schools that participated in this research, as well as to my funders. And thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was wonderful. So I will quickly introduce our last speaker for today, who's Dr. Lisa Zunshine. Professor Zunshine is the Bush-Holbrook Professor of English at the University of Kentucky. She's a leading expert in cognitive literary studies and a former Guggenheim Fellow. She's the author or editor of, I believe, 12 books, including in 2006, particularly relevant for this panel, Why We Read Fiction, Theory of Mind and the Novel, and 2015, Getting Inside Your Head, What Cognitive Science Can Tell Us About Popular Culture, and then most recently, just this year, The Secret Life of Literature came out on MIT Press. So Professor Zunshine, over to you. Thank you.
My talk today brings together cognitive science and literary studies to talk about a particular mind-reading pattern which has been with us for almost 4,000 years, but has until now remained invisible to both readers and critics. The key concept from cognitive science that I will be using is embedded mental states, that is, mental states about mental states. In our daily social interactions, we sometimes embed mental states within each other on a pretty high level, as in, for instance, I can't believe that she does know how we all feel about this, or she didn't want me to know what she was really thinking. On the whole, however, most of our daily social interactions do not rise to this high level. Instead, they stay on the first or second level. Is she angry? I don't know how I feel right now. Sometimes I wonder if she's thinking about me too. Similar, a variety of our daily written discourses, including newspaper articles, may occasionally embed mental states on a third level, but can also get by staying on the first or second level. Take a look, for instance, at these two randomly selected excerpts from the New York Times and Columbia Spectator. In newspapers, you will see a lot of first level embedments, plenty of second level embedments, and only occasionally third level embedments. Literature is where it gets interesting. As I argue in my new book, which came out last month at the MIT Press, literature as we know it today cannot function without constantly embedding mental states on at least the third level. Specifically, novels, short stories, plays, narrative poems, and memoirs concerned with imagination and consciousness constantly embed mental states on a high that is at least third level. as in mental state within a mental state within yet another mental state. In literature, embedded mental states can be found on the level of individual sentences, paragraphs, as well as whole chapters. They can belong to characters, narrators, implied authors, and implied readers in a vast variety of combinations. They can be explicit or implied, or it can be some combination of the two. And I'm going to give you a couple of quick examples. In Joka Hardy's novel Celestial Bodies, a young woman named Havla cannot understand why her sister Asma does not realize that the religious texts that she is so fond of bore other people to death. Havla was astonished at how oblivious Asma seemed to the awful boredom these ancient books induced. In a 9th century English poem, The Wanderer, the protagonist wonders, indeed, I cannot think why my spirit does not darken when I ponder on the whole life of men throughout the world, how they suddenly left the floor hold of proud fames. Or to put it more prosaically, I wonder why I'm not depressed when I think about death. If you want to think about implied mental states, think of Yaga, who intends that Thalia imagines Desdemona is in love with Cassio, or Tom Sawyer doesn't want his friends to realize that he hates whitewashing the fence. Now, one question that I was curious about is whether writers themselves are aware of the extent to which their texts depend on the constant embedment of complex mental states. To answer this question, I enrolled several years ago at the seminar in the creative writing program at my home university. This experience involves paying close attention to my own writing processes and to workshop discussions, because like other participants in this workshop, I had to come up with 2 original short stories and to have other people comment on them. Here's what I found. It's impossible to write fiction while thinking about embedding mental states, because the state of mind in which one puts oneself as a creative writer is very different from that of a literary critic. At the same time, even though I do not think consciously of embedding complex mental states when I'm writing fiction, I nevertheless keep coming up with social situations that call for such embedments. In other words, a creative writer puts herself into a state of mind in which she produces complex embedments without being aware of doing so. Moreover, after the first draft is done and I start revising it, thinking consciously of ways to add yet another mental state to this or that social situation becomes helpful to some degree. It seems that in the process of revision, a writer begins to think like a critic, or at least more like a critic than she did before. Now, do writers talk about embedding complex mental states during the workshop discussions? They do not. They are not familiar with this vocabulary and thus do not use these terms. However, when they comment on each other's drafts, their suggestions for improvement tend toward making social situations present in the original more emotionally complex, which of course depends on cultivating complex embedments and mental states. Thus, they may say, the protagonist doesn't know it, but are we supposed to think that the text knows it? Or, even if the narrator is unsure what the story is about, the reader must sense that the author knows what the story is about, what it's doing. Or to quote from a longer written response to one of the stories, the simplest way I can think of for this would be to utilize a third-person perspective, so the narrator could give us insight that the current narrator wasn't willing to. Or you could leave it in the first person and just use the asides of the narrator to also give us possible suspicions that might be fleeting in her mind that she refuses to give much thought to. So that means that one second, I think I'm in the wrong slide. In other words, while both writing and revising, that is talking about their crafts, writers operate on a higher level of embedment, even if they're not aware of it. Indeed, if my own experience is to be trusted, then consciously focusing on embedding mental states is detrimental to all of these processes, although it's significantly more detrimental during the initial writing stages. In some ways, the process of generating complex embedments without being aware of it while writing provides a useful insight into our reading practices. For there too, mentalizing takes place mostly away from conscious access. To make sense of what we read, we constantly process complex embedments. Yet if we pause and take stock of doing so, the pleasure of reading may evaporate. And I now want to show you what happens when a workshop discussion may lead a writer to increase the number of complex embedments in her stories. So a person wrote a short story and brought to the workshop, and the story contained the following sentence. I don't wish to know where Julia and John go together and what they do, but of course I keep asking and she tells me. Now this sentence already contains 1/3 level embedment. The protagonist is aware that she can't stop herself from doing something that she knows will make her feel bad. Then the author shared this story in the workshop, and she received the suggestion that you have already seen, namely, highlight the difference between the past and the present narrator so that the asides of the present narrator can give us possible suspicions that might be fleeting in her mind that she refuses to give much thought to. So after the author revised that story, here's what she came up with. I don't wish to know where Julia and John went together, what they did. But of course I kept asking and she kept telling. Today, I think it is odd that Julia didn't seem to realize it. It was painful for me to listen to those stories. But perhaps she did realize it, which was yet another sign that she had already given up our friendship. I can say that now, knowing how quickly we were about to grow apart, in spite of my desperate attempts to hold on to her. At the time, however, I interpreted her behavior differently. It made sense to me that she would not think that I might be hurt by John's choice. After all, I did not consider myself lovable either. This is at least 4 more third-level embedments, which gives you a pretty spectacular illustration of what writers intuitively expect from their own and other people's texts when they revise or give suggestions for revisions. So here's another question that I was curious about. As I mentioned before, real-life situations do not necessarily contain a whole lot of complex embedments. So what happens when writers start out with their presumed memories of what really happened and then transform them into works of literature, as for instance, in cases of life writing? To answer this question, I looked at an autobiographical novel, The Patterns of Childhood, by the famous East German writer Christoph Wolff. The Patterns of Childhood focuses on a young girl named Nellie, who is the stand-in for Wolff, who grew up in Nazi Germany and actively participated in the girls' wing of Hitler's youth. The Patterns of Childhood is structured as a journey. It tells the story of the middle-aged Wolff visiting her hometown and struggling to reconstruct her childhood experience and subjectivity. The novel is intensely introspective. It is both an autobiography and a meditation on memory, and its original manuscripts are available. This means that if one has a hypothesis, as I did, that manuscript revisions tend to add complex embedments to the text, one has an opportunity to see if this hypothesis is borne out by evidence. The Academy of Arts in Berlin has 2 typewritten versions of Wolff's Patterns of Childhood, an early one and the one mostly identical to what went to print. I thus worked with two typewritten versions of one particular chapter, file 562, the early version, and file 580, the later version. What I found was that the changes between file 562 and what eventually went to print indeed all featured new complex embedments, subtly transforming the meaning of many original passages. In what follows, I present you with 2 case studies exemplifying these changes. My examples come from chapter 10 of Patterns of Childhood and describe the relationship between Nellie and her teacher, Julia Strauch, a prominent Nazi leader. Nellie adored Julia, and Julia considered Nellie her star pupil. Yet almost every encounter with Julia involved some form of deception and mutual manipulation. And we can see, as we trace the changes from manuscript 562 to 580, how Wolff developed exact nuances of this mutual manipulation. My first case study concerns the conversation between the teacher and the student, in which Julia manipulatively uses the tone which she knows makes Nellie feel safe and share her innermost feelings with her. This is what it looks like in the original file. Julia didn't reprimand, but remained encouraging and understanding, exactly the tone which, as Julia knew only too well, gave direct access to Nellie's innermost being, that Julia read as an open book. And here is what changes in file 280. Wolff adds a little phrase, Nellie knew that Julia knew. So the revised sentence reads, exactly the tone which, as Julia knew only too well, as Nellie knew that Julia knew, had direct access to Nellie's innermost being. If we map out the embedments present in the original, we get Julia knows what Nellie is thinking, but the revised version makes the situation more complex. Now Nellie knows that Julia wants to know what Nellie is thinking. This is the 4th level embedment, and it changes the social dynamic of what is going on. In the early file, Julia reads Nellie as an open book. But now, if Nellie knows that Julia knows which tone to use to best manipulate her, then Nellie is not completely readable to Julia. Here is my case study 2, which is a bit more complicated. describes a conversation between Julia and Nelly in which Julia wants to remind Nelly that Germany is at war and is not doing well. So to support their country at this hour of need, the girls in her class have to be on their best behavior, not to pass notes to each other, not to form little cliques. But what's actually happening is that there is a new girl in class whom Nelly really admires and who doesn't really care about what Julia thinks of her. But Nelly decides not to mention that to Julia. So they part, and Julia says, well, girl, you'll do it, meaning you'll behave as a good German girl should when her country is at war. So here is what we have in the original file, 562. Not a word about that to Julia. Instead, the appearance of being reasonable as always, accepting her farewell greeting. Well, girl, you'll do it. But then Wolf complicated the situation, file 580 as follows. Not a word about that to Julia, instead of appearance of being reasonable as always. And yet, although unintentionally, a touch of distance, which was enough to make Julia pronounce the sentence Nelly had vainly waited for so long. Well, you and I know what we mean to each other, don't we? The sentence came too late, no doubt, and had almost lost its magic effect. Nelly wouldn't have admitted to herself, but she had felt a sneaking suspicion that Julia might be calculating. If we map out the recursive embedments present in the original passage, we may come up with something along the lines of Nelly doesn't want Julia to know what she is really thinking, which is already a third level embedment, pretty complex as it is. But the revision adds on a whole bunch of new complex embedments, such as Nelly suspects that Julia is aware that Nelly does not want her to know what she is really thinking. So she wants to remind Nelly of her awareness of their special bond, of their awareness of their special bond. This, of course, makes Nelly wonder if they indeed mean to each other as much as Julia wants her to think they do. What is the effect of the changes that Wolf is introducing? Or to put it differently, what's the effect of her adding more complex mental states to her original text? One key effect is that Nelly is now portrayed as more aware of her and other people's mental states. And that connects the child Nelly with the writer that she is destined to grow into. This is a really important thematic development, and it raises all kinds of questions about, for instance, how memories of the past are constructed to meet the present requirements of the person who is doing the remembering. Here, Wolf has to forge some connection between the little girl who was brainwashed by the Nazis and the independent thinking writer that she grew up to be. Adding more complex embedments to her text allows Wolf to make that connection. Here's what I want to ask in conclusion of my talk. If literature, as we know it today, cannot exist without constantly embedding mental states on at least a third level, would it be ever possible for it to break free of this pattern? It seems that writers attempt such breaks with some regularity, yet they manage it only to a point. The odds are stacked against them. Reading complex intentionality into literary text, which is to say intuitively expecting literary subjectivity to be constructed as a series of complex embedments, explicit or implied, has become our standard experience of literature. Imagine then an author who is firmly committed to writing a novel that will transcend this pool of embedded subjectivity. Not that she herself will put it that way. She may think of it as anti-psychological or surface-based or story without interiority, you name it. That writer will face an uphill battle at every step of her interaction with her audience. Readers will come to her novel intuitively expecting to encounter recursively embedded subjectivity of either characters or of characters, narrators, and implied readers. They will force read as much of this kind of subjectivity in her story as the text itself, its cultural context, and their own past reading history will allow them. Critics, too, will find ways of talking about embedded thoughts and feelings by speculating about her intentions and describing their reactions. If her novel is adapted for screen, social situations featuring calling for complex embedment of mental states will be introduced. And that will in turn influence the experience of readers who will come or return to her novel after watching the film. Can our experimental novel survive this onslaught of embedded mentalizing and even start a new literary trend of embedment-free writing? Perhaps it still can, but it won't be easy. Thank you.
Thank you. That was fascinating. And actually, your last point made me think of a lot of experimental literature from the 1950s and 60s in France, which I think tried to do some of the things that you mentioned, and the reaction was not an easygoing one. Okay, if I can please invite the speakers to turn on the video again for the Q&A. That would be fantastic. So thank you all. We have approximately 25 minutes and almost as many questions in the public Q&A. So I'm gonna keep my own to a bare minimum. But I just wanted to just start with one broad question. I don't know if you're going to find that it's slightly off topic perhaps, but I couldn't help but notice that there was a strong consensus here in the powers of creative fiction writing and theater and that domain to sort of enhance and forge our abilities to empathize and to construct theory of mind. And this really kind of seems to grate against the reality that those faculties that we have are so selectively applied and sometimes not applied at all, right? So my kind of paradoxical image is, what sort of sense does it make evolutionarily or morally or at any level really for me to be the kind of being who can go to the movies and empathize with a character on screen to the point that I'm moved to tears and then leave the theater and be completely unmoved by the plight of somebody who asks me for change as I leave the theater. So there seems to be no strong connection between what is real, and real was one of the three domains of our title, right? It was real and fiction and play, and our willingness to utilize these wonderful fine qualities that we have. Does your research offer any kind of way to think about this apparent paradox? That's all. And this is for all of you, so please, anyone start as you prefer.
I think this is a critically important question in all of this work, and I tend to think about it in two ways. The first way I think about it is in terms of the fact that, at least in the theater and in an acting class, this is a safe and distanced space from reality. We often found our teachers saying things like, leave your problems at the door, leave the outside world at the door with your backpack, then come in here and act as if this space does not affect the rest of the world. And this goes along with theories of fiction as distancing, and that you need to be able to distance yourself from what's happening on the screen in order to then embrace the emotions that are brought up. So I do think part of the paradox is that the reason we can feel these emotions is because of that distance, right? Because of that safe space. And therefore it becomes harder to take what you've learned or gained in these fictional worlds and apply it back to the real world. I think the second piece of this has to do with what kinds of media and what kinds of fiction we engage with, and therefore who we consider to be part of our in-group. So if we're engaging with forms of fiction and media that are just about people who look like us and act like us and are part of our social in-group, then we may not actually be expanding empathy for people who are part of our social out-group. We may just be strengthening the empathy we have for our kin and our colleagues and our friends. And so this is when media scholars, particularly scholars of color, say things like representation matters, and particularly for young children, exposing young children from diverse backgrounds to children from more diverse backgrounds, right? So exposing children across different kinds of groups may be a way to overcome this idea that maybe all we're doing is strengthening empathy for our in-group.
Yes, Lisa.
I'm actually very careful in my work not to make any claims about empathy. I work with theory of mind, and I do not say that reading fiction makes us more empathetic. I'm not saying it doesn't, it's just I do not feel qualified to make such a claim, and I'm very careful never to make it. And I also tend to think that reading fiction does not necessarily make us better people. I think reading fiction certainly makes us better readers of fiction, okay? We become much more sophisticated in how we read mental states of characters, of narrators, of implied readers, of other critics. people within that cultural context, of first readers of that work of fiction. We become really experts on that. Does it mean that we become better people? Not necessarily.
Mm-hmm. Meghan, did you want to add to this?
Well, one thing I was thinking when Lisa was speaking was we actually gave that kind of dovetails with what she was saying. We did give our fiction experts and our controls like a standard measure of trait empathy. It's called the empathy IRI, and there's different subscales. So one's like, how likely are you to experience personal distress to somebody else's suffering, or take their perspective, or have empathic concern. And I think the fourth one is like literally about fiction. It's like engage with fictional world.
Fantasy orientation.
Exactly. And what we found was that our creative experts in fiction only scored significantly higher on that dimension. So they seemed to be able to report that they would get more immersed in the characters of fiction, but it didn't seem to translate to the other aspects of the empathy scale. So that's consistent with what Lisa was saying. Yeah, and the only other thing I was thinking about when everyone was talking was whether it's possible that sort of the function of storytelling and listening to stories is more about learning sort of morals and social rules for you to navigate your space, as opposed to, unfortunately, like translate and go out and help others, and I think that's an open question, but and it would be nice if it actually also helped us help others, but it very well might not be the case.
Great, thank you. That's why I wanted to open with that question, because I think it's sort of, I think, and that's why also Lisa reacted by pointing out that she does not countersign the statement that literature makes better people, is because that's kind of if you want the happy misreading that one could give to the kind of conversation that we've been having, right? So just one more, and then we could go through some of the Q&A perhaps, but one item that caught my mind as I was returning to sort of old research for this event is that there was a wealth of coinages and new words that came out trying to pin down this faculty over the last 150 years. And one of them is a coinage that the Russian philosopher Bakhtin used briefly before then sort of discarding it. And I'm not even going to try to pronounce the Russian word, but I think it translates as something into like live entering or live entering into, right? And I made sure to pull out a quote by a scholar describing what Bakhtin meant by this. And he said, the idea is to enter actively into another individuality, another perspective on the world, without losing sight even momentarily of one's unique perspective or one's own surplus of life experience and one's own sense of self. So the question is that I think all of you in some way have touched upon the question of the self-other boundary and where one ends and the other one begins. What does empathy do to that? What does your research have to say about that?
Well, I can't speak of my own personal research on this, but I think there is research in social psychology suggesting that the process of empathizing with others and the extent to which you report being immersed in that experience does sort of lead to an increased blurring between the self and others. So I think this is old social psychology work suggesting that this process of empathizing sort of creates a little bit of confusion between yourself and the other identity. So it's consistent with what you're saying.
I will say in the developmental psychology literature, there's often this idea of the cascade of social skills. So children have to learn various social skills in order to then have the underlying skill or ability to move on to the next one. And what I've seen in the studies I've done with 4-year-olds as compared to the studies I've done with students who are 8 or 9 years old, and then students who are 14 or 15 years old and who have acting experience or not, is this cascade. So in the very youngest children, as a result of engaging in a role play curriculum, a creative dramatics curriculum, we found increases in emotional control and lessening of personal distress, but not increases in empathy. The idea being, if you become emotionally overwhelmed by the emotions of others, you can't actually experience empathy because you're too busy with your own personal distress. But then in middle childhood, and particularly particularly in adolescence, we find that the acting class experiences are associated with students who already have higher levels of emotional control entering into the classes. So they already know about this ability to control their emotions before they even take the acting class. And then as a result of the acting class, we see advances in these empathic responses. And so it may be that you need to have certain skills and abilities in place to maintain that distinction between self and other before you can start to gain in that sort of fellow feeling, in that understanding of the other's perspective.
Thank you. And Lisa, did you want to, nothing to this? Okay, thank you. So Pamela, do we want to go to the Q&A? I see that some questions have been upvoted. Yes.
Yeah.
So,
Would you like me to read them, or do you have some in mind already that you want to read out? I have a list.
why don't you pick?
Okay. The first one is from one of our faculty in the Scholars in Society and Neuroscience program. It's for Dr. Meyer. The areas recruited by fiction experts include regions associated with social semantic knowledge, including one's own autobiographical experiences. It is possible that these fiction experts more richly encode their own experiences and remember them with greater detail and vividness. And if so, could this provide a richer repertoire of personal experiences on which to draw when simulating the experiences of fictional characters? And that's from Professor Kevin Oxner.
Okay, great. Thank you, Kevin, for the great question. That's really interesting. We don't have any data to sort of speak to that. We did not include any tasks where we had, for example, our fiction experts retrieving their own memories. That would be really interesting. Your suggestion does kind of fit with the stereotypes that we hear people in the fictional world say, like, you know, a lot of times novelists say, like, write what you know, or, you know, when people are going through acting exercises, they might try to retrieve a time when they felt a certain emotion that they're trying to portray in their character. So I think there's these hints to this possibility that there might be some sort of basic mechanism for, you know, enhanced social learning and knowledge retrieval that they're able to access. And I think we just don't know the answer to it yet. It would be really cool to run studies like similar to what Thalia is doing in kids, you know, having them retrieve their memories though, and then following them, you know, down the line. Do any of them end up becoming, I don't know, actors and directors themselves? That would require a lot of money, but it would be an interesting thing to explore.
Do any of the other panelists want to comment on that?
Just that if that study happens, call me up because that sounds fascinating.
Okay, great. I have another question from a former member of the Society and Neuroscience community, Dr. Claire McCormick, who says, what a fascinating trio of talks. Valerio at the start mentioned differences between pathos or more emotional empathy versus cognitive empathy. Again, for Dr. Meyer, could you see any difference in your MRI studies between different types of creative experts during imagination tasks? For example, maybe writers think more, but maybe visual artists feel more, seen at the level of the brain. And related for Dr. Goldstein, are there certain kinds of students who have more success tapping into different forms of empathy? Understanding individual differences in routes to thinking empathically could be interesting for psychologists, for example, in autism or in parenting.
Yeah, I can jump in quickly with whether we had neural results that changed as a function of whether they were writers or directors or actors. So we ran those analyses. We didn't see any statistical differences within our group of fiction experts. That said, we had a pretty small sample, right? So we have like 27 fiction experts overall. That means there were only about 9 actors and so on. So I think we didn't really have the statistical power to detect differences, unfortunately, but I think it's a really interesting question to ask. And yeah, it would be really fascinating to find out.
Yeah, I think it's a very important question to ask because it really is about sort of the cognitive skill of understanding versus the emotional skill of activating a feeling and then controlling a feeling. I think in my work, we've certainly found differences by age. So younger children, the tasks are more emotion focused and the tasks for the children are more emotion focused and about controlling their emotions, activating their emotions. whereas the older adolescents are focused more on cognition and really thinking about characters. So when we've looked at younger children in acting classes, we find much more of an emphasis on the body and awareness of the body and feeling the body, which is of course an emotions task, because emotions are embodied and emotion regulation is about controlling the reactions of the body and mind together. Whereas for our older adolescents and in our professional actors, when we've worked with professional actors, there's much more of a discussion about the cognitive control and the cognitive understanding. I will note though that depending on which acting theory perspective you're coming from, there's more or less of an emphasis on cognitive understanding versus emotional feeling versus just pure physical portrayal. I don't know of many professional actors who claim adherence to a singular acting theory and that's the only thing they do. Most in our work report on the use of multiple constructs and multiple theories and ways of portraying character. So I think the distinctions there in practice may be more porous boundaries in practice than maybe in theory, but certainly in development, we see clear distinctions.
Pamela, I think you're muted. So.
I just asked if Dr. Zunshine would like to say anything about that. Thank you,
Yes.
Valerio. No, okay. Let me move to a different set of questions. There were several questions at the beginning, I think mainly for Dr. Meyer, but it kind of can be directed at all of the speakers, which is what kinds of differences or controls did you have on your studies for gender, for diversity, for cross-cultural expressions or understanding of states of mind?
Yeah, I can chime in really quickly about the two studies I presented. So we kind of had this tiered process of first recruiting as big of a creative sample as we could for both the online study and the fMRI study. And once we saw who we could like grab, then we tried to have what's called like a yoked control. So a matched control condition person who was similar to who we recruited on a number of dimensions. So including gender, we tried our best for age. Age did not end up being the same into the two groups. So we ended up controlling for age to account for that. In terms of diversity, in terms of like ethnic and racial diversity. So we tried, we tried to have it as unbiased sample as we could. It didn't end up yielding like an unbiased sample. It's a predominantly white sample, but it's not entirely white. And then in the instances where someone was participating and was non-white, for example, we would match them with someone had similar demographics from the control group. But it's an interesting thing to think about moving forward, how diverse experiences might impact these results.
I will say in my study where we were trying to get a nationally representative sample of schools teaching acting, we did have one of our school districts that was majority Indigenous students and the children of migrant workers in Northern California, so Hispanic and Indigenous. And then another one of our schools was majority Black and Hispanic students who had auditioned to get into that magnet school. So we did purposefully find schools that involved students of color, Black, Hispanic, and Indigenous students. I will say that we looked carefully because this was a qualitative analysis. We really did try to pay attention to what distinctions and differences we may be able to tease out. And what was particularly interesting for me was that the content of what the students were being taught was different amongst the schools. So for example, in the school that had majority Black and Hispanic students, they were being taught plays with themes around social justice, racial equity, and racism. There were really interesting conversations about how the few white students in those schools were often asked to play characters that espoused quite abhorrent and racist views in the exercises that they had to do in class. So there were a lot of conversations about how do you portray horrific things on stage and how do you think about yourself in the status of portraying characters that you fundamentally disagree with. But in our schools that were majority white students or were in white neighborhoods, there was much more emphasis on sort of the Western canon of literature and drama, such as Shakespeare. However, despite those differences, we had a lot of psychological similarities across the classrooms. They were still using the same habits of mind to teach their students. They were still dividing their classes into the same kinds of activities. So the content was individualized by school and by social identity, but the format we found to be the same across the different school districts, which I thought was just spoke so well to the flexibility of literature and theater to be unique to the population that it is there to serve.
Very interesting. Any? Okay. So there are so many interesting questions. Our time is, rapidly coming to a close. But I want to ask. There's several questions around the issue of suspicion, faking emotions, comments on Schadenfreude, imagined hurt in others, bringing about the self-perceived joy within. So I just wonder if maybe we could start with Dr. Zunshine, whether you have comments on those kinds of mental states being portrayed, embedded mental states in fiction, whether there's anything interesting to say about not so much maybe what we might call sincere empathy, but faked and self-consciously faked, or at least suspicion and Schadenfreude. Somehow those are connected in my mind. I'm not sure whether I'm successfully bringing together all of these different comments.
Well, Pamela, let me start with something and see how it works with whether it answers your question or not. There are okay, wait a second. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes.
There are particular emotions that are already complex embedments, right? These are social emotions, for instance, such as embarrassment and shame, right? Because if you think about hypocrisy is another one, since you mentioned faking. Because if you think about, if you sort of unpack embarrassment or shame, it's I am thinking what other people are thinking about my intentions, right? So it's sort of a compressed third level embedment. And literature loves shame, embarrassment, hypocrisy, lying, right? If you want to look at the history of complex embedments, if you want to look at the earliest instances, like in the Epic of Gilgamesh, right? In the Iliad and the Odyssey, they all have to do with lying, okay? So this compressed social, as I call compressed embedments, complex social emotions that have to do with faking, lying, hypocrisy, shame, embarrassment, they are really rich sort of ready-made packets, right, of complex embedments that writers sort of plug in as often as they can.
Wonderful. Anybody else from the panel want to comment?
Just one of the things that makes those social emotions so interesting to learn about is they are unique by culture, right? And they need to be learned by children explicitly. This is sort of the definition of faux pas and creating faux pas, or when you engage in a faux pas, the reason you do it is because it's not natural, right? It's not sort of inherent to development. You have to learn what is appropriate and inappropriate in certain situations. And the only way to learn that is either to experience it or to be taught it in some way. So that's something that's particularly interesting about those kinds of emotions.
So one more question. I know we're at time, but it's just there were too many instances of it in the chat, which is social media. Yeah. What can you say about this topic, theory of mind and social media, how it teaches, how it doesn't teach, how it directs by likes and so on? Anything to say about that? Lots of people had questions.
One thought that occurred to me, I saw one of the questions someone was asking about the TikTok videos and like,
yes.
Does that work to engage social cognition? I hadn't thought of it before, but in a way, it's interesting. Like in some ways, young people these days have more opportunities to try to be creative experts, like try to be fiction experts. They're their own editors, they're their own producers in ways that are just so much more like prevalent than they have been in the past. So I don't know, I think it's an interesting question. It's possible that they are engaging some of these simulation muscles and storytelling muscles more consistently than they had been in the past.
Yeah, and this idea of creating a self that is then portrayed, I think is something that a lot of social media experts have been talking about. This idea of branding yourself or having a particular kind of presence or being a particular kind of TikTok poster, particular kind of Instagram poster is a sense of self-reflections and self-metacognition that I think, with rapid feedback from others that then requires you to integrate it, that I think is this sort of embedded mind reading and autobiographical sense of self that social media just sort of turns on hyperdrive in a way that other forms of childhood activities don't.
Well, to build on what Thalia just mentioned about metacognition, metacognition is basically thinking about thinking, right? It's not that this is, somebody said, she thinks it was a wonderful panel. Well, was it really a wonderful panel? I don't know. I have to remember that she is the source of that representation, right? She thinks it was a wonderful panel, right? So it's an interesting question, to what degree, to what extent, and how social media experiment with our ability to meta-represent, to sort of to keep track of sources of representations, right? This is not just a fact. Somebody claims, somebody thinks that it's a fact. Somebody wants you to think it's a fact. So it's not exactly necessarily third level embedment, but it's an interesting metacognitive tracking going on a second level at least.
Yeah.
Or not going on, which is also a big problem. Somebody asked about brainwashing. If you lose that source tag, somebody, I mean, in the chat, in the comment, notice, ask about brainwashing. If you lose that source tag, if you process a certain representation as just a fact, not just somebody's thinking that it's a fact, there are certain social effects of that, right?
Valerio, I'm going to give you the last word, and then I will just sum up.
My last word is just to say that this was, well, I say from my perspective, this was a wonderful panel. And so I want to thank all three speakers. Thank you very much. This was a large and unwieldy topic, and I think we managed to make some sense of some pockets of it. So we will take that with us. So thank you.
Yes, and I will just say from my perspective, this is society and neuroscience at its best. And I know that the audience is also thinking that because they were so incredibly engaged in the Q&A. So I want to thank our audience for coming up with such good questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them. Really fantastic. And I want to thank Dr. Amoretti for his organization, to our previous scholar, Claire McCormack, for her ideas about this program. And I especially want to thank our three panelists who were just fantastic, so interesting. We'll be thinking about this for a long time. So thank you all. Thank you to the audience, and thank you to our center staff, especially Joseph Sulik and Melinda Miller. And join us on May 11th for our next event. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us this afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.